This is Tom Fox. I would like to welcome you to a 5-part conversation with K2 Intelligence Fin on navigating an increasingly complex sanctions landscape. This podcast series is sponsored by K2 Intelligence Fin. In this conversation, I'm joined by Adam Frey. Adam is a managing director at K2 Intelligence Fin, working across both financial crimes, risk and compliance, investigations, and disputes practices. As a key member of the firm's independent consultant team at the direction of federal, state, and international regulators, he works to monitor and assess global financial institutions' compliance with AML and OFAC enforcement actions and related consent orders. Frey helps K2 Fin's intelligence reviews of institutions, BSA, and AML sanctions programs. He helps clients mitigate risk associated with litigation, alleged misconduct to ensure their anti-corruption and international financial sanctions policies and procedures. Also, Eric Lorber, who is the vice president at K2 Intelligence Fin, where he advises global financial institutions on issues related to sanctions and AML and combating financing for the terrorist compliance. Prior to joining K2 Intelligence Fin, he was senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he provided strategic guidance on U.S. sanctions, AML, and CFT policies. He's previously worked at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where he advised clients on the areas of international trade and compliance. In this series, we will take a look at the current landscape. In Episode 2, Building Sanctions into Your Compliance Program. 3, So You Think You Violated a Sanctions Breach, What Happens Next. 4, A New Exposure for Corporates in Shipping Space. And conclude with What's Down the Road. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back again with Adam Frey for our concluding episode in our 5-part series. Today, we're going to go to one of my favorite places, that veiled land of the future, to ask how to prepare for what's next and issues that Adam sees on the horizon. So, Adam, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be back and look forward to our discussion again.
Adam, we've talked about all the specifics really on the latest on sanctions, but what can companies do to not only address them and prepare for the unknown?
Thanks, Tom. That's a really great question and obviously the $64,000 question here. I know my colleague Eric touched on this a little bit in one of the other episodes, but just to expand on that a little bit more, I think the very first thing is make sure all staff understand their sanctions risk and the importance of complying with the organization's sanctions obligations. And we talked a little bit about this before in a previous episode, but really the two critical components there are tone from management, tone from the top, and ongoing training. And those are going to be critical to having each and every person internalize their ownership of the risk. The second is staying informed of the very fast-moving landscape. Subscribe to regulatory updates and alerts. Subscribe to industry alerts. To the extent you have time, keep abreast of the developments in the news and industry, industry publications. Third, ensure that you have adequate resources to address the issues. So that can include, trying to leverage existing resources where possible, or even leveraging third-party providers if and when your internal resources are not available or aren't sufficiently, or don't have the sufficient or appropriate expertise.
Adam, you said something in an earlier podcast about having each employee own their own financial risk, giving them the training on what they need to look for, giving them the ongoing support, perhaps educating them on how they could either speak up, raise their hand, or get the information to a subject matter expert in compliance. Would that be a way that you could see a entity having both not only the flexibility to deal with future issues that are on the horizon, but also sort of the robustness of a compliance program that could go in a different direction if it had to do so?
Yeah, I think absolutely, Tom. I think, to the extent that you can get each person at the ground level, understanding that they're responsible for the sanctions risk, or at least understanding what the sanctions risk is of their activity, of their product, and that at the end of the day, the bank's risk or the institution's risk is their risk as well. That culture of compliance and that culture of understanding that risk can only redound to the benefit of the organization. You'll always need the compliance department, the second line of defense, and the control functions. But to the extent you have buy-in from all employees, it definitely is something I think that can only be for the good.
And one of my observations about the coronavirus health crisis has been that it didn't really start new trends in compliance, but it may have accelerated trends that were already in place. So I was wondering what you might see as some of the other trends. Do you see those trends accelerating because of the massive changes we've literally had in the last 30, 60, 90 days? Or where perhaps else should a financial crimes compliance practitioner look?
So from a sanctions perspective, Tom, I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that there are multiple different programs and targeting either list-based or countries, but you're actually starting to see the overlap there. And I think to your point about things accelerating, you really see how globally connected and how everything kind of ties together. So, for example, you'll see how currently, the OFAC is looking at targeting Chinese entities, but it's under the Iran program, or their Russian entities under the Venezuela program. And so you really start, or Iranian entities under the Venezuela program. So I think you're starting to see how connected everything is to itself, and you really can't look at things in isolation. I think another big trend, and I know my colleague Eric spoke about this before, is how the government, or OFAC, and the U.S. government is now expanding out their sanctions enforcement and their scrutiny beyond the traditional financial institutions and more towards everyday corporations in the maritime industry, in the shipping industry, insurers, port operators, and corporations that I think have never really thought of themselves in that space. And I think that's something that goes to the awareness that we were just talking about, where people really need to understand how these risks apply to them in a very real and tangible way. That it's not theoretical, it's not outside of their purview. And at the end of the day, the government is going to expect certain things from their company, and their company is then going to expect certain things from them.
Adam, as we conclude this series and this podcast, I was wondering if there is anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with from this series. I guess from my perspective, it's the dynamic nature of, obviously we talked about the dynamic nature of sanctions and how under this administration they have moved so dramatically and so quickly. But I also see, and I've heard from you guys, really a same sort of dynamicism in compliance programs and the need for compliance programs to be agile and nimble to respond to these. Anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just a couple of thoughts to add to that. One, to that point about the nimble compliance organization, and also to the point about the sort of accelerating effect of COVID-19. Despite the economic crisis, regulators are showing no sign of decreasing scrutiny or enforcement of sanctions, or really any kind of financial crime violations, be it sanctions, fraud, bribery, corruption. And so, even if resources are tight now, we see constant pressure to cut costs. The performance will be down, and bottom line will be impacted even more. I think it's critical that now is not the time for compliance programs to go lax or to let down their guard. In fact, it's probably a time to be even more rigorous in what you're evaluating. Second, I think to the extent that violations do occur, and obviously, no organization can be perfect, and no compliance program can be perfect. But to the extent that you can demonstrate a strong program and a strong track record before something happens, we've seen that the way the government may look at you would be impacted by that. So again, I think this goes to the idea that now is the time, if there isn't a problem, when it's really the time to put the resources in and get your house in order, so that if something happens down the line, you can demonstrate that you had a strong program in place to try and prevent it in the first place. That old adage, I hate to say it, but the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think in this case, and with compliance in general, it's very much true. And finally, just to add to the point that, at least with sanctions in particular, that scrutiny is expanding beyond the traditional industries and corporations and financial institutions where it's been focused. And so maritime industry, shipping, insurance, a lot of other companies that deal with exports to some of these countries and high risk geographies that may not have thought that really either the sanctions applied to them or that they had to worry about it, probably need to make sure they're getting up to speed on these different programs. And finally, there are resources out there that can help you do that.
Adam, I wanted to thank you again. This has been a fascinating series of podcasts, and I really appreciate you visiting with our audience to help understand this particular set of problems. So I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thanks, Tom. It's been my pleasure, and really appreciate you having us on for the conversation, and look forward to speaking again.
Hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode in conversation with K2 Intelligence Fin on navigating an increasingly complex sanctions landscape with Adam Frey, Managing Director at K2 Intelligence Fin, and Eric Lorber, Vice President at K2 Intelligence Fin. This 5-part podcast series was a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network, sponsored by K2 Intelligence Fin.